Welcome to this Big Bookshare podcast. My name is Sebastian Groes. I'm Professor of English Literature at the University of Wolverhampton. I am originally Dutch and I was born in a small village close to Amsterdam. During my teens I got hooked on English books. I was blown away by Shakespeare's play The Tempest. I saw this play in Dutch and I thought, man, if this is so bloody good in Dutch, how amazing will it be in its original English version? I read more and more novels in English and was attracted by this particular world. Its long and rich history, to me, seemed endlessly fascinating. The Big Bookshare is a new project which is designed to get prisoners reading more and talking more about books. Reading is a great way of spending time in prison. As well as being a fun thing to do, it can bring all sorts of benefits, including boosting your well-being. It can also be a great way of making connections with other prisoners. Sharing a book recommendation can be a great way to get to know someone better. And of course, if you find reading difficult or struggle with English as a second language, picking up a page turner can be a great way of boosting your skills. The Big Bookshare is a follow-up project to the Novel Perceptions project, which is helping us think and rethink the public's relationship with books. As part of that project, we're really interested in learning more about how and why people choose to read and share books in the way that they do. So by taking part in the Big Bookshare and telling us what you think, you'll be contributing to an important nationwide research. Your views might just help us reimagine which are the books we buy, celebrate and teach. In this podcast, we'll discuss Saroo Brierley's wonderful autobiographical novel Lion, which was originally published as A Long Way Home. For me, the book touched me personally, as I know myself what it's like to live in a country that is not my own, and the difficulties that come with adapting to an alien culture and its specific cultural codes, and also adapting to a new language. Luckily, I lived in London for the most part, a city in which everyone is an outsider. This transcultural aspect is something that Saroo captures really nicely. One thing that I really like personally about the book, and that is about memory. It is a memoir. And I like the way in which Saroo is really honest about the trauma of his experience of getting lost as a young boy and finding his way home eventually. Memory to me is really fascinating. It's famously unreliable, and we know that often the mind forgets some bad things and some good things, but that's something that I will discuss in more detail a bit later. I'm also interested, for instance, in a way in which we remember the photos of an event that happened in the past rather than the event itself. And Saroo is really capturing the way memory works really nicely. And perhaps the most important reason why I like this book, it's such a deeply human book. The traumatic loss of losing one's family, the urge to find one's biological family, and the quest for identity are all issues that resonate with all of us on some level. And the final triumph of the book, finding his family but having to kind of admit that he's living in two worlds, cleanses us. It purges us from the inside, as the Greek philosopher Aristotle would say. You feel a better human being after reading the book. During the podcast, you will hear various passages from the book to do what we call close reading. To think about the meaning of words in detail, something that you may well do yourself anyway. These passages will be read by creative writing lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, Dr Rob Francis. Towards the end of this podcast, Rob will invite you to do a number of creative writing exercises that will help you gain an even better understanding of Lion. It will also help you to develop your own writing skills, use your own imagination and reflect on your own life. But before we do that, I will take you through some of my own observations about the book. And I will ask you at certain points to stop and think about the book, about these specific issues that I'm really interested in. Are you ready? The Proust phenomenon. One thing that struck me that throughout the book, Saroo observes much with his senses, and then especially with his nose. There are many passages, especially from his childhood, in which he talks about the smells of food, of spices, of the city, and of the spaces like his childhood home. Here is a passage from the chapter in which Saroo was lost and wanders through the streets looking for food.
Over the next little while, I came to know the neighbourhood around the station, including the little shops and stalls where I foraged for food. The smells coming from those shops were irresistible. Mangoes and watermelons, fried savouries, and from the sweet stalls, gulab, jamuns, fried balls of milk and sweet cheese soaked in rosewater syrup, and ladus, sweet fried dough balls. All I could see was people eating, a group of men cracking peanuts and chatting, some others drinking chai and sharing a small bunch of grapes. Hunger gnawed at me then, and I would go to every shopkeeper and beg. They always chased me away, along with the half-dozen or so other children hanging around. There were too many of us to take pity on. I'd watch people eating. They were poor people like my family, so they didn't usually leave good food behind, but they might drop something or not finish it entirely. There were no bins, so when a person was done with something, they simply threw it on the ground. I worked out what leftovers could be safely eaten, just as back at home my brothers and I knew which food to scavenge on a railway platform. Bits of fried food like pastry-wrapped meat or vegetable samosa were pretty safe once you scraped off the dirt, but they were highly prized. The race would be on to snatch up any remains before other scavenging kids.
The connection between smell and childhood is not new. Over a century ago, the French writer Marcel Proust was thinking about this in his novel In Search of Lost Times. He describes a passage in which he's just sitting around and dipping a Madeleine cake in his tea. The combination of the tea and the cake triggers something in his brain, because suddenly he's being transported back to his childhood. He's being transported back to Cambrai, the place where he grew up, to parks, to his school, to some of his favourite childhood spaces, and then finally to the house in which he grew up. This prompted many psychologists and neuroscientists to think about the relationship between smell and childhood. What they found out is that smell is different from the other senses. Smell has got this privileged kind of access to the brain. It is a shortcut, and it also has a privileged access to generating and regenerating childhood memories, many of which are often associated with happy memories. It is striking that Saroo goes on at great lengths to describe such passages about smell. Needless to say, these traumatic episodes that he describes in his book, when he's lost, will have had a great impact on him as a young boy. And we see him depicted as being very hungry, but there's something more about these passages. They are longer, more intense, and there seems to be more emotional content to them. So the act of remembering his childhood seems to go much easier when he's associated them with smells. And strangely, despite him describing his hunger, he also seems quite excited about the smells still, as if they were connected to positive memories. So here's maybe an exercise to think about your own relationship to smell. Please think of your own childhood smells and some of the memories that you associate with them. Nature via nurture. Lyon is also a book that thinks about an old debate, the relationship between nature and nurture and how they shape our identity and social behavior. So on the one hand we have got nature, which largely refers to our genetics. It includes the genes that we're born with and other hereditary factors that can impact on how our personality is formed and influence how we develop from our childhood onward. On the other hand, we find nurture, which encompasses the environmental factors that impact on who we are. This includes our early childhood experiences, the way we're raised, our social relationships, and our surrounding culture. Whether nature or nurture plays a bigger role in our personality, in our character, shall we say, is one of the biggest and largest, oldest debates in philosophy and also within the field of psychology. Saroo's story is not simply about a boy who grows up and is adopted, but it's also kind of a way of thinking about the nature-nurture debate. The novel functions as a laboratory for thinking through that relationship. So please listen to this passage in which Saroo tells about the Brierleys adopting a second child from India because Saroo misses his sister so much.
We might have been sent a young girl or an older child, but as it happened, we got my little brother, Mantosh. I didn't care that he wasn't a sister. The idea of having another child to play with at home was enough for me. And assuming he'd be rather quiet and shy like me, I thought I could help him adjust to this new life. He'd be someone for me to help look after. But although Mantosh and I were close in age, only a year apart, we were very different, partly because of the natural differences between people, but also because of our different experiences in India. I was reticent and reserved. Mantosh, at least at first, was loud and disobedient. I wanted to please. He rebelled.
This passage is interesting because he casually notes that he's aware of the nature-nurture debate. It seems that Saroo understands that both are equally important to shape his character and that of Mantosh. He notes that Mantosh and he are doubly different because of their difference in character, but also in their background, and both have shaped them. And now, today, most science recently has acknowledged that nature depends really on genes and that genes need nurture. Genes not only predetermine the broad structures of the brain, they also absorb formative experiences, react to social cues, and even run memory. They are consequences as well as the causes of our willpower. But experiences can also flick switches in our genes. This is good news, people. Yes, much of our genetic makeup has an influence on our lives and behavior, but experiences, learning are instrumental in establishing change in us. So, context is extremely important in how we are shaped. At the end of Lion, when Saroo visits his family in India and he also visits his father, he is very confused. He says the following.
As I spent more time with my family and reconnected with the place I'd been born, I thought about the word everyone kept using, including me. Home. Was that where I was finally? I didn't know. After I was lost, I'd been lucky enough to be adopted by a loving family. Not only had I lived somewhere else, but I'd become someone else from the person I might have been had I stayed in India. I didn't just live in Australia, I was an Australian. I had a family home with the Brierleys and had made my own home in Hobart with my girlfriend Lisa. I knew I belonged there and that I was loved. But finding Kandwa and my Indian family also felt like coming home. Something about being in the place just felt right. I was loved here too and belonged in a way I'd not thought about much beforehand and found hard to explain. This was where I'd spent my first years, where my blood was. So when it was time for me to return to Hobart, a time that came around far too quickly, I deeply felt the wrench of leaving. I promised my mother, sister and brother and their young families that I would be back soon. I had come to see that I had two homes, each with their own emotional connections, even if they were thousands of kilometres apart.
So Saroo here admits that nature is very important. India is where his blood is, where his genetic makeup has come from. Though in terms of his nurture, he now has two important phases that have shaped him. His Indian childhood, which he spent in poverty, but also the Western upbringing in Australia. In another twist, though, Saroo says, having flown back to Australia to his adoptive family,
looking at their faces, I realised that they didn't know if I still wanted to be here, or was thinking of moving back to India. I reassured them I was still the same Saroo, although the experience had changed me in important ways. It took me a while to feel like my old self again, though, and to look at Hobart through my old eyes rather than those of a poor Indian person.
This shows the complexities of identity, but also its mutability and flexibility. What I personally take from Lion is that even though we can live split lives, living two half-lives is difficult, yet in the end we can have both. So here's another exercise to maybe think about. What is your opinion about the relationship between nature and nurture? How do you see both sides operating in your own life? So these were just some of the things that I noticed in Lion. Of course, there's plenty more to discuss. What other issues do you find interesting in the book? Please discuss this with your fellow inmates, and we can also talk about this at one of the up-and-coming Big Book Review workshops in the prison library. I will now hand you over to my colleague Rob Francis, who's going to offer you his thoughts on the novel and also invite you to do some creative writing exercises with you. Many thanks for listening, and I look forward to meeting you at some point.
Creative Writing Exercise 1. Think for a moment about the importance of food in connection with the senses for young Saroo and how his memories of his childhood are connected to smells. Can you think back to your own childhood and think about the foods that you remember from your time as a child or teenager? Which brands do you remember? And which smells and tastes do you associate with your most happy memories? Which smells do you hate? Please write a 500-word piece capturing the relationship between your childhood memories and the smells that are part of it. Creative Writing Exercise 2. Imagine you're able to write to the young Saroo at the time when he was lost and confused about his situation. What advice and words of comfort would you give him? Can you write a short letter to Saroo? Creative Writing Exercise 3. A haiku is a poem that originates from ancient Japan. It's a short, 3-line poem using the following pattern. In line 1, you have a 5-syllable count. In line 2, you have a 7-syllable count. And then in line 3, another 5-syllable count. Can you write your own haiku that captures your thoughts about Lion